Hello from Times of Türkiye. Today we will be talking about the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which took place in the United States of America. It was a turning point in recent history, which changed many things in the daily lives of people as well as in international relations. American politics has changed as well as its intervention in several countries, with an impact on the perception of Muslims all around the world. Kadir, you were in New York at that time. Let's start with your initial response and what you felt on that day in New York when you witnessed 9/11 attacks.
Thank you, Talip Hocam, for this opportunity. Of course, it's been 20 years and, it's easy to say, but it's been 2 decades. And as you mentioned, the world has changed. I was, in fact, in Manhattan that day. I had, I was driving down on Henry Hudson Parkway and I saw all the smoke. And I remember telling my wife, I hope it's not us, meaning Muslims were somehow behind this attack, horrible attack. But I think everybody felt that at that time the world would not be the same anymore. And this came to be true. As you said, the world politics has changed in a way that has been sort of irreversible in many ways. From national security, our understanding of national security, to international terrorism, to invasions and nation building, and then daily life, right, in the US too, and for Muslims as well. I was just starting grad school at Columbia in New York, and that was my first week or so, something like that. And what I remember was, there was a lot of, media did focus on a lot of attacks and, sort of backlash against Muslim population, Muslims living in the US. But there was also a lot of sort of people coming together. And we saw that in mosques. Often that Friday and the following Fridays, the mosques were filled with Christians and Jews and Buddhists and others trying to learn and trying to also stand with Muslims. So it went hand in hand. Yes, it had a greatly corrosive impact on the perception of Muslims, understanding of what Islam is. There was a lot of backlash, a lot of attacks, unfortunate events on Muslims and people who looked like Muslims, but they weren't even. So it was a big tragedy. It had a big sort of societal impact. And I remember at Columbia, that was, there were only a couple classes of Arabic, and it just demand skyrocketed so much that, they had to cap it at, 13 different groups of Arabic students, new students. Anyway, and people started reading Quran and, going to the mosque to learn. And some were straightforward, would say, we're trying to understand the enemy. So they were, but then, there were a lot of people who genuinely wanted to find out about Islam, what this was coming from, etc. Of course, this is a terrorist attack. And the unfortunate thing was, the connection between terrorism and religion just was seen so close after that. But ultimately, it was a terrorist attack. It was a political act. But the US response did not want to treat it as a terror attack only. It saw it as an attack on American way of life, and it went on to respond in the ways that we know that essentially changed the world politics. So I don't want to go on too much, but I think it would be very helpful from your perspective, how you saw it when you were in Turkey at that moment.
Kadir, Turkey felt sorry for what happened, of course, on that day, 20 years ago. When I look at back, I feel that almost everyone in Turkey, regardless of their ideological orientation, regardless of their ethnic background, they felt in pain for the Americans. And both Turkish public and the Turkish state officials at the time sided with the American administration, and they expressed their solidarity with the American people. I think that's what humanity requires. Turkey as a country, which was also a hub for some terrorist organizations at the time, or as a country which experienced terrorist activities, we know the pain of the people. Turkey had that experience over the last maybe 40 years. And later on, of course, as you would remember, Turkey was target of Al-Qaeda terrorist attack in Istanbul. A consulate, a synagogue, and a bank was attacked by the terrorist organization, and many Turkish people also lost their lives. That's why Turkey felt very close to the American people and American public. But also Turkey refrained essentializing Islamic and Muslim identity. Turkey condemned the terrorist attack, but also refrained using generalizations such as Muslim terrorism or Islamic terrorism, because in the American media, as you would remember, around these days, there was a portrayal of Muslims as if they are a security threat, as if they are the source of terrorism and violence. Therefore, I think when you look at the Turkish public opinion at the time, you would see that Turkey supported US administration in their attempt to portray terrorism as a global threat, that's for sure. But also I think when we look at Turkish reaction, it is very clear that Turkey called on US officials and the US media, US academics and people in the think tanks not to use this essentializing language, associating Islam with violence, because historically speaking, this is not right. And Islam means peace. Islam means respect for diversity, respect for the coexistence of different religions, ethnicities, and belief. Turkey is a host, as you would remember and as you know, to a Christian community, Armenian community, and also Greek community. These are the heritage that we have had from the Ottoman period. And when you look at the Ottoman period, there was a coexistence of all these groups in peace, which we called it a millet system at the time. And Turkey, I think, had that understanding of coexistence of different religions. Therefore, anything that is any organizations that is using religion as a springboard for terrorism or as a justification is not accepted in Turkey. And Turkey, I think, announced this very clearly and condemned all terrorist attacks, because Turkey was also a victim of terrorist activities all around the world. But now, I would like to come to a point that I want you to address actually to this issue. This will also, I think, made an impact on the relations between US and Turkey at a later stage. What was the policy responses of the US after 9/11? Because that some of the positions that US took place differed from the rest of the world, because US took some unilateral actions, which also impacted its relations with the Muslim world in general and with Turkey in particular.
Yes, the U.S. policy response was really, if you look at the videos of President Bush at the time, he basically called the world leaders and told them, you're either with us or against us. So, that anger by the U.S. Policymakers, that feeling that they needed to find the terrorists and whoever helped them, bring them justice and get revenge for the US. That was a very strong feeling that was palpable. It had overwhelming support by the American public. And when you look at the kind of war resolutions sort of bill that went through Congress, there was only one no vote. And this includes today's like political leaders like Biden himself as well, Clinton and others. Everybody felt that the US needed to take action and go after terrorists, Al-Qaeda, that was at the time in Afghanistan. So the world didn't really, oppose this. The world in general, like you said, Turkey, they did acknowledge the need to go after terrorists, and this was now a global threat. The world was not going to be the same anymore. People understood this. So when they gave an ultimatum to the Taliban to give up Al-Qaeda, they gave a relatively short deadline, and then they, toppled the Taliban regime and then went after Al-Qaeda. But and that was done relatively quickly. But when the US administration turned its attention to Iraq and claimed relationships between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, and then claimed that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, everybody, well, Europeans especially, and Turkey and others around the world started having questions. What's happening here, right? We understand Al-Qaeda attacked. They organized. They were in Afghanistan, and Afghan leaders, Taliban leaders at the time, they were in power. They didn't give them up, so they were housing them, etc. So we understand this much, but what's happening here? You're turning to Iraq. And many years later, in 2008, as you remember, Obama, when he was running, that was one of his top criticisms of the Bush administration. So in many ways, Bush was a new president too, right? He hadn't spent much time in Washington, but this attack happened, and then basically it defined his presidency. His response to sort of either with us or against us, and then we'll go after terrorists. These were broadly understood, but then within a two-year period, turning the attention to Iraq, it just something didn't feel right, and Europeans, Turkey opposed that, and then the policy decisions that were made later were in some ways catastrophic for U.S. foreign policy. And as you saw a couple of weeks ago, we discussed this, Biden pulling out of Afghanistan after 20 years, right? 20 years of engagement there, military presence, invasion, nation building efforts, etc. It really put U.S. in a situation that it couldn't get itself out of. Because it defined this war on terror. It didn't declare war on a country. It didn't declare war on a specific sort of target, but terror in general. And then wherever terror went, the US was willing to, after the with the idea that, we'll take it wherever it is around the globe. And that neoconservative ideology really, really put U.S. in a different kind of. It gave, it was an unprecedented policy choices that the U.S. got into these wars that have lasted so long.
Kadir, I think when we look at the justification of U.S., I think there are a lot of weak argumentation by the US at the time. As you have said, when US decided to intervene or occupy Iraq, one of the reasons that is expressed by the US was that they have had biological weapons of mass destruction. And today, when we look at the case, there was no evidence whatsoever. There was reports, allegations, but the whole country was unfortunately invaded, and the system just destroyed. yes, Saddam was an authoritarian, I think, leader. He was a dictator, that's for sure, I mean. But here we see that I think there is a gray line here when America decided to go after terrorists, which is justified in defense of US interests and in defense of US lives, I would say. But I think it turned out to be, in the case of Iraq especially, this liberal interventionism, bringing democracy to a country, getting rid of a dictator and establishing there, as you have just, I think, alluded to, engaging in a nation building process. Mm-hmm. When we look at Iraq, I think, as the result of intervention, I think everything turned out to be the other way around. When you look at Iraq today, instead of building a nation, we see that there is a lot of disintegration, especially along the lines of ethnicity and sectarian identities. Today, unfortunately, Baghdad does not have a strong influence in the periphery. Yes, in the center, maybe Baghdad is influential. When we look at from this perspective, I think many people argue today that this liberal interventionism did not bring democracy at all, but catastrophe in many countries, not only in, of course, Iraq, but when you look at other cases as well. Here, just I would like to draw attention to the relations between Turkey and US as old allies, as members of NATO, and also as I think countries which had long term relationship, very positive relationship. At times, of course, they had ups and downs, but I think invasion of Iraq was a turning point in recent Turkish-US relations, as far as the lack of confidence, as far as the damage to the relations between the two. Because US decided to go into Iraq, decided to invade Iraq, but for US, I mean, when you look at the map, Iraq is thousands of miles away from US, and there is no immediate threat at least from the Turkish perspective. But Turkey has a border with Iraq, and whatever happens in Iraq, it would have had direct consequences to Turkey. That was the reading of Turkish authorities at the time. A neighboring country, yes, of course, I mean, Turkey did not say that the regime was a democratic regime. Turkey never approved dictatorial policies of the Saddam Hussein at the time. But if a country falls apart, if a state is fallen, as we see now, there are lots of failed states around Turkey, that would have had a direct impact. And we have seen later on the impact. We can talk about the migration, we can talk about refugees, we can talk about how terrorist activities are taking place, we can talk about how Al-Qaeda and also PKK carved up a space for themselves in some parts of Iraq too. And in 2003, the relations between Turkey and US became strained, because Turkish parliament did not pass a resolution which would allow US troops to go through Turkish land. And that was one of the critical points in Turkish-US relations. And I think when you look at the origins of that problem, it goes back to the 9/11 because of the US decision to go after terrorism. But sometimes I just want to raise this question with you, how it was perceived by the US when Turkey did not allow, Turkish parliament did not allow the usage of Turkish territory to go to Iraq, how that was perceived in US. But also my second question to you is, we are talking about war on terror, but many people in the Muslim world, they say that this is a war on Islam rather than a war on terror. How that is framed in US as well? Can you just look at these two issues from a US perspective?
I'll try my best. Yes. So Iraq, the neoconservatives defined the problem behind 9/11 attacks as a problem of absence of democracy. The people in these repressive regimes, since they didn't have democracy, they were resorting to terrorism. So when they defined it like that, and then used the that feeling of the need for revenge, right? Somehow get back at terrorists, they harnessed that energy, but used it for a broader political sort of ideological approach to international relations. And as you remember, President Bush, within months of the attacks, identified 3 countries as axis of evil. These were Iraq, Iran, and North Korea. But the attackers did not come from these countries. None of them did. Of course, including Saudi Arabia would be out of the question, of course, but that it's not like it would be better if he included. Anyway, the point is, the Iraq, they identified Saddam Hussein and people like him, authoritarian dictators around the world as the main cause of the problem, and they needed to be eliminated, and they needed to be replaced by democratic systems. What happened, like you said, they expected everybody to line up with the US, either with us or against us. That was true for Afghanistan, but now they demanded a similar thing with Iraq in many ways. So they expected Turkey to line up and allow US forces to enter from the north, and make the sort of invasion of Iraq much quicker, much easier for the US. And they offered some financial incentives, etc. But I think they underestimated the anti-war feeling, both in Turkey and in Europe as well. Many countries said, hold on a second, what's happening here? So when Turkish parliament refused that entry, remember, the US actually had sent its military and they were preparing to enter Turkey. They thought it was just like a vote that was just going to pass anyway. They didn't expect the resistance by the Turkish public and its influence on the Turkish parliament. And that was a big problem in the relationship in the following years, because the US looked at it like, okay, you didn't line up with us against terrorists. It's only once, and as you know, after the invasion started, Turkey actually did allow some overflight rights, etc. It's not like Turkey wanted to block the US. It's just that it didn't allow to open a northern front. Also, Turkey was worried about PKK, right? In the first Gulf War, that had caused a lot of trouble for Turkey. That's a long other story, but the perception in the US was that Turkey was not behaving like an ally, like it should. It's only when they failed to find weapons of mass destruction that both Europe and Turkey and others were vindicated in many ways. So for a couple of years, it really impacted the US-Turkey relationship badly. This question of war on Islam, in the very first days, I think 14th of September, Bush gave a speech, and he had rabbis and Muslim leaders, American Muslim leaders, right behind him. Remember that speech? He emphasized that Islam had nothing to do with terrorists, but they were going to go after terrorists, etc. Of course, words and deeds, right? When it keeps, the US looked like it kept going after Muslim countries, and then implemented these surveillance programs against Muslims, etc. So the perception became over time, especially heavily, that the US was at war with Islam. And it didn't help that a lot of Muslim leaders, American leaders, used that kind of language or insinuate it. And there was, in the US, there were some projects like mosque building projects. The most famous one was near the Twin Towers in that district to build a mosque. That was a big backlash. There was a big backlash against it. So the US was trying to understand what's going on, the public, but at the same time there was backlash, and then they were going after Muslim countries in the eyes of most of the Islamic world. So it was a very difficult time period, but we can't say the US really managed this well at all, especially with the start of Iraq's invasion and disbanding of the Iraqi army, and then, you know, a de-Baathification process, and then demanding that democracy be established. And then, of course, Abu Ghraib prison scandal in Iraq, those images of, you know, US military personnel mistreating and, you know, doing torture, and all of that really added to that perception that the US was really not going after terrorists, but it was going after Muslims around the world. That's an unfortunate, you know, consequence of war on Islam. And in recent years, with the rise of Islamophobia and xenophobia in the West, we have seen a lot of references back to those times.
I think we can come to that point a little bit later on how the perception of Islam has changed and what happened to the individuals over there and Muslim institutions, etc. But I just would like to point out a few things on the case of Iraq, because 9/11 and the US policy right after that, which was framed as you know, fighting terrorism or combating terrorism, etc. And as you said, this was justified, and I think people around the world and many states supported the US. But I think when you look at the wider impact and broader impact of 9/11 with regard to American policies, I think it is much broader and much wider. It is not only, you know, fighting terrorism or combating, you know, terrorism, etc., war on terror, but it is much beyond that. As we have said, I think the whole international relations, the power balance, and especially regional order in the Middle East has changed to a large extent. When you look at Iraq and what happened later on, when we look at Iraq, for example, we see, yes, Saddam has gone. I think everybody's happy with regard to the, you know, eliminating a dictator, that's for sure. But what happened later on? What followed? We see today that almost, I think, 800,000 people lost their life when Iraq was invaded by US. After that, these are the official figures. Maybe unofficial figures are much higher than that. And the country lost its human capital to a large extent. We have seen many IDPs, internally displaced people in the country, and also sectarian identities all of a sudden emerged very strongly between Shia and Sunnis. And also in the north, the Kurds carved a territory for themselves. We can see that, I think, the state institutions have just fallen apart, and today it is the same. There isn't much of a change. But I think, as you said, the US announced Iran as one of the countries in the axis of evil. But today, Iran's influence is much higher than many other countries in Iraq. It is the result of US policy of invading Iraq and then withdrawing from that place and leaving it to, I think, to Iran. That is how people in the Middle East read what happened in Iraq. So you can see it is not only, you know, war against terror. It is much beyond that, I think. You know,
if I may interrupt very briefly, the irony there is that, you know, a global war on terror resulted in the, you know, sort of the end of Taliban rule in Afghanistan, end of Saddam rule in Iraq, both of them kind of arch enemies of Iran. And it gave, you know, it allowed Iran to increase its influence in the region broadly. And like you said, Iran was supposed to be part of the axis of evil. So as I said, the policies that were followed did not really, you know, resonate, were not really in line with the goal of going after terrorists, but it became a much broader agenda of reshaping the region through this neoconservative ideology in many ways.
Right, I think now, so far we have discussed international relations, power balance, etc. But I think one of the important impact or consequence of 9/11 was about Muslims themselves and how Muslims are perceived in the United States of America, how they are treated, and also how this impacted Europe and the world outside Europe as well. When we look at US, I think, policies and also rhetoric, especially in the media and by some of the leaders, we can see that there is a lot of securitization of Islam and Muslims because of these associations between Islam and violence. Today, when we look at some survey results, I think we can see that impact still, I think, is there. Many Muslims in the West, they are citizens of the countries in which they are living. Mm-hmm. Most of the Americans, for example, Muslims in America, they are American citizens. And most of the Muslims in European states, they are born and brought up, educated, and they are living in those countries. However, when we look at how Islam is portrayed by the dominant media, by the dominant political discourse, I think because of the lingering, in my view, impact of 9/11, there is a lot of, I think, issues that we need to address. One issue is, I just raised with you. Today, Center for Public Affairs, which is based in the US, released a survey result, Kadir. They say 53% of Americans have unfavorable views of Islam and Muslims. More than half of Americans, unfortunately. 42%, they have got, relatively favorable views. But when you compare this with their favorable views of Christianity and Judaism, it is much higher. I mean, the favorable views. So how do you think this will be interpreted by Muslims when you look at this survey? I will talk about the survey in Europe, but I think when we look at how Muslims are, let's say, portrayed, how they are treated, it is not only a rhetoric. When we look at how the law changed, for example, maybe you can refer to American Patriotism Act and its consequences. I think there are a lot of complexities over there that Muslims are now scapegoated and also illustrated as a security threat.
That's right. Professor Küçükcan, Talip hocam, the US handling of the 9/11 and what happened afterwards in terms of the perception of Islam is a very long, complex story, actually. When I mentioned at the beginning, there was immediate backlash, but there was also, a lot of curiosity, a lot of groups trying to learn and trying to understand the religion, and all those efforts did help a lot. I think, number of Arabic speakers in this country has gone skyrocketed. Number of people who understand, who have read Quran in the US have skyrocketed. But of course, the question was not really about religion. It was about terrorism, and it's been very hard to define it around that. It's been very difficult to define it as a matter of politics rather than matter of religion. So all Muslims were somehow associated with those events, and they had to explain themselves. They had to keep telling their American counterparts, I mean, they're American, but like, let's say non-Muslim Americans, who they were not, right? I'm not this, I'm not that, I'm a Muslim. But they had an identity crisis in many ways, to having to explain yourself every day, whether you condone terrorism, whether you agree with this and that. So there was a lot of broader, societal pressure on them, on their mentality, etc. So, and we are talking about people who are born here, who are raised here with American values, and they're just darker. Their families speak Arabic, etc. So part of the problem in the US, in America, is that Muslim population is very small. It doesn't exist in many places, and then they've been used as scapegoats, like you mentioned, by politicians, especially in some non-urban areas. When you go to New York, maybe Chicago, big cities of America, it's a different story than the suburbs and the rural areas. So that's one thing. The other thing is these invasions that lasted so long, and we've seen civil wars and we've seen many American casualties along the way, they continue to be associated with Islam and Muslims because these were Muslim countries, those casualties were coming from there. And then political project didn't succeed, right? Again, America is bringing freedom and democracy, but somehow these Muslim countries, they're hopeless. And excuse my language, but in Trump's language, these were shithole countries, right? So the politicians didn't help. These invasions lasting so long didn't help. Muslim population being so small and less visible in the US compared to others didn't help. And I'm sure in Europe, in your experience, you know Europe much better than me, of course. It was a bit of a different story because there are larger Muslim populations there. But if you can touch upon them, that would be great for our viewers, I think.
I think we are running out of time, so I will just very briefly touch on the experience of European Muslims. I think 9/11 had repercussions for Muslims in Europe as well. Whatever happened in the United States of America in terms of increasing negative perception of Muslims, I think we have seen this in Europe as well. As Islamophobia increased, as hate speech, hate crimes against Muslims have all increased. Fundamental Rights Agency, which is based in Vienna, that is part of the European Union, they have a lot of reports on the case of Islamophobia, for example. They all see that after 9/11, along with the negative portrayal of Muslims, along with the political rhetoric, very negative rhetoric towards Muslims, that has I think that has an impact on the daily life of Muslims. When you look at, for example, headscarf issue in Europe today, again, resurfacing all the time, we have seen that the religious freedoms were curtailed, unfortunately, like in America. We have seen surveillance of mosques, which never happened before 9/11. I think when we look at from this perspective, as you have just said, and I have emphasized in the beginning, we can talk about the world before 9/11 and the world after 9/11. Unfortunately, after 9/11, perception of Muslims became quite negative in the eyes of the West, and that had some consequences. It is not only image. Image now has consequences on the streets. When you see Muslim on the street, people do have some suspicion. People do look at those people as if they are, a threat. I think this is something that we need to challenge as people from the academia, from different walks of life. Therefore, one needs to look at 9/11 to take some lessons, not with regard to the terrorism only. Of course, yes, we need to condemn terrorism in all its forms, but also when it comes to the political impact that it might make on Muslims. I think we should all keep this in mind. Kadir, we came to the end of our discussion. It was a lively discussion. Thank you very much for your contribution, but we need to stop here and say goodbye to our audience. Hope to see them later on. Okay.
I want to add one more thing. I'm still hopeful about this new generation. There's now, those who were born after 9/11 are adults today, and they do question everything. They have a different perception. They have many more, Muslims friends from different backgrounds. So hopefully they will change these perceptions in the years ahead.
Hopefully.
I wanted to end on a hopeful note. Thank you.